Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor Jon V. Kofas is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a brief analytical session on the war that Israel launched on June 12, 2025. Today is June 25th. The ceasefire, assuming it holds, supposedly ended yesterday on the 24th. So this lasted for 12 days with a considerable support of the United States behind Israel. And as it turns out, with the relative isolation of Iran, the fact is many countries that publicly stated they supported Iran all along did not. The question, of course, is what were the war aims of the Israelis and the United States? What were the goals they were trying to achieve? Were those goals achievable through a military solution? Was this an exercise in futility that resulted in enormous cost to the United States taxpayer, to Iranian lives above all, as well as Israeli lives, and to the destruction of physical facilities damage both in Iran and Israel? In the last analysis, what we can see, given that Trump has come out on his way on June 24th on his way to a NATO meeting, where he discussed all of this, at least some of it. What we have seen is that the war between between Israel and Iran, which again, Israel began bombing Iran on June 12th. And the United States was fully supportive. This coming at the tail end of U.S. negotiations with Iran on its nuclear development program. And Israel, all along, even before those negotiations started, opposed to any diplomatic solution with Iran, any negotiations at the diplomatic table between the United States and Iran. The fact is that Trump admitted that regime change, which was a goal of both Israel and the United States, in fact, to the degree that Israel had a number of targeted assassinations of top Iranian officials, some successful, some not, including threatening the life of the Ayatollah Khamenei. That was one goal. Trump admitted only yesterday on June 24, 2025, that regime change, which the United States had gone back and forth on this, would be chaotic for everyone involved. The idea that one could get regime change and bringing back the son of the late Shah of Iran before the 1979 revolution was at the very least delusional and even critics of the theocratic regime in Tehran would argue that, if anything, bombing of Iran by Israel and the United States only strengthened the Ayatollah's regime. It did not weaken it, and these are not the kinds of conditions where regime change takes place. That's one issue. The other issue, is it up to the United States and Israel to determine what kind of regime Iran has? Is it for the United States and Israel governments to determine what kind of regime they want in Tehran? And of course, the answer to that for those two governments is yes. And the reason is because that is the legacy of the 1953 coup d'etat that the CIA staged, overthrowing the duly elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 and installing a puppet regime headed by the Shah, and that lasted until 1979. That regime was loyal to the United States, to the West. It was loyal to Israel as well. There were extensive economic relations with Iran providing especially energy to Israel, while Israel was providing two things. One is military equipment, and the second, the Israeli intelligence agency Mossad was instrumental in the Shah's regime. So this is the kind of regime that the US and Israel wanted. The Trump administration, Trump himself admitted regime change would be chaotic. Even if it would not be chaotic, the fact is it's delusional because it could not take place. Even the harshest critics of the Ayatollahs, as I said, argued publicly that if anything, the bombing by Israel of Iran, unprovoked, by the way, simply because Israel wanted to convert, to change and divert focus from the genocide war in Gaza, ongoing since October 2023, to convert that into a conventional war, get the United States involved, and of course, divert focus to this being a legitimate war against one of the axis of evil countries that the United States and Israel believe Iran is, and to them it is. Trump, of course, also criticized before leaving for the NATO summit meeting. He criticized both Iran and Israel in very harsh language that obviously cannot be repeated in public. But he left most of the criticism for Israel, and Israel did back down after those comments. And Trump implied what the world knows, because there is a record, an empirical record of this. It's not something that is hidden, namely that the government of Israel, throughout the execution of this war against the people of Palestine, especially Gaza, the victims who are civilian, Israel has lacked credibility, and Trump implied as much when he lashed out against Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel. The other revelations that were brought by the Trump administration, brought out by not the Trump administration, the US government, I should say, is that the US media, because US members of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives, specifically Joaquin Castro from California, a member of the House Intelligence Committee, revealed that the U.S. knew ahead of time that I'm sorry, not ahead of time, but right after, not ahead of time, but right after it bombed the 3 nuclear facilities in Iran, the US government knew, the Pentagon knew that those facilities were not destroyed. It may have set them up a few weeks to a few months, but that's it. They also knew, because the Saudi scientists who measured radiation readings revealed immediately after the bombing of the 3 nuclear facilities in Iran by the United States, they knew that radiation levels were unchanged in Iran. So the bombing had no impact, although it cost hundreds of millions to the United States taxpayer, by the way. The other revelation was that regime change, as unfathomable, as chaotic as Trump pointed out, as it would be, would not come to Iran. On the contrary, the government in Iran has been strengthened. However, what is possible now in the aftermath, again, assuming that Israel does not resume bombing of Iran, we don't know what it will do, that government change in Iran and Netanyahu era may be over. It's not that regime change is going to take place in Israel, but rather that change in government in Israel is very likely, and some kind of a truce, ceasefire, and the end of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, as Senator Bernie Sanders pointed out, for over a month now, not a trace of humanitarian aid is getting into Gaza because Israel is preventing it. This is from Senator Bernie Sanders on the floor of the United States Senate. Israel's foreign policy and that of the United States, driven, of course, by the United States, driven by the United States government, driven by the Israeli lobby and pro-Zionist groups, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, has been a disaster. The foreign policy has been a disaster, and it is proof. The proof is in the results of that foreign policy. The destabilization policy by Israel and the United States of the entire Middle East, with Israel targeting Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and of course, as of late in the last 12 days, Iran, that has created chaos on a global scale, because the impact on world markets, because of the fluctuations in energy prices, as those of you who follow the fluctuation of those prices have seen, indicate that indeed this was a reckless policy, and it achieved absolutely nothing, given that just this morning, 25th of June, 2025, President Trump announced at the NATO meeting, this is just the latest announcement of President Trump, that negotiations for a nuclear deal in exchange for lifting economic sanctions by the United States and the West, by the way, not just the US, look very promising. So all of this proves the disastrous, reckless foreign policy pursued in 12 days of June 2025. Let me give an overview of Iran, the so-called menacing country. In 1979, Iran had a revolution. It was a heterogeneous revolution. It wasn't sure who was going to take over because everyone was involved against the Shah's regime, which was a puppet of the Western Israel. Okay. But the result of that revolution was that the Ayatollah Khomeini, who had been exiled in Paris, took over and Iran became a theocratic society. And once he took over, while it was not pro-Soviet back then, of course, the Soviet bloc still existed, it was anti-Western and anti-Israel. That is a matter of record. Iran, ever since the 1979 revolution, became the focus of all evil for both the United States and Israel, but also much of the Western countries as well. That also is a matter of record, historical record. Now, Iran is a country today of 90 million, roughly 90 million people. Most of them are Shia Muslims. Iran is not a wealthy country. It is energy dependent. It is one of the world's largest oil producers, with 4%, ranking fourth in the world in terms of oil reserves and number 2 in terms of natural gas reserves. It depends on the revenue from these energy sources, fossil fuel resources, to sustain its economy. The number 1 customer for energy for Iran has been China. China buys roughly 2 million barrels a day of oil. Iran has been increasingly dependent on China for economic development. It has nowhere else to turn. Iran is not a country that has had the best relations with its Arab neighbors. This war between Israel and Iran, with the United States behind Israel, that Israel launched on June 12th, proved that the Arab countries, indeed the Muslim world, was not really that keen behind Iran. It was, in fact, more on the side of Israel and the United States than it was on the side of Iran. Unfortunately, even as all of these countries, from Turkey to Pakistan to the Gulf states, which were very liberal with the rhetoric against Israel and the bombing by the United States, all along they were cooperating with the United States and were continuing cordial ties with Israel and normal economic relations. Iran's GDP per capita is around $16,000, which is a year, which is about $10,000 than the world average. So Iran is not a wealthy country. It has official unemployment of 10%. It's much more, it's probably higher than that, and youth unemployment certainly higher than that. And the inflation rate, which is the killer for the Iranian economy, and this is what the regime has been trying to do, is address some of these issues, is at 33%, running at 33%. And poverty, depending what source you look at the very least 20% and higher than that. So Iran is not a wealthy country. Is it a country that is better off in terms of health, education, housing, and inequality? In other words, the social metrics after the Ayatollah Khomeini took over and to the present, from 1979 revolution to the present? And the answer is yes, especially in the education. it has made remarkable progress. However, Iran has not achieved its full potential economically. It has tried to do this in the last few years with the assistance of China, signing major deals with China, and it has become geoeconomically dependent on China and geopolitically dependent on Russia. Strategic ties with Russia are very important. In fact, Vladimir Putin boasted, according to Trump at least, this is according to Trump, we don't know if Putin said this, but Trump said that Putin basically told him on the telephone, what can I do for you to help with the situation in Iran? And the answer on the part of Trump was, well, you can help me with Ukraine. I have the Iranian situation under control. Again, this is Trump. So we can take that for what it's worth. But it is true that the Iranian foreign minister did consult with Vladimir Putin after the US bombing. And it is true that Vladimir Putin has some influence with the United States administration, with the Trump administration on Iran. China was more or less on the sidelines, although publicly supporting Iran. It's not. It's Iran, of course, with China as its number one trading partner, publicly supporting Iran in rhetoric, but really on the sidelines for most of this period, while Putin tried to use, benefited from all this, by the way, one of the big beneficiaries from the Israeli attack on Iran and the US bombing of Iran and the US behind Israel has been Russia. Although we now see that this may actually lead to finally an end to the Ukrainian war. Again, this is the latest news from today's NATO meeting in Europe. It started last night with the welcoming committees, but it seems that we may see some progress in that regard. Now, the issue of Iran as a nuclear threat to the region, to Israel and to the United States security interest. The United States has 19 military locations of military presence throughout the Middle East, by the way, an easy target for Iran. The issue of its, let's deal with that. The issue of nuclear threat. Well, Iran was in negotiations with the Trump administration before the Trump administration decided to allow Netanyahu to begin bombing Iran, provoke Iran into this war. And then the United States itself getting into bombing, of course, the three sites. And we'll talk about how the latest revolutions, how ineffective that was, by the way. Again, this is from US press and US revelations in House and Senate hearings by House and Senate Democrats coming out and saying, by the way, the administration did not come clean. The Department of Defense did not come clean. It was not forthcoming, in other words, with regard to how effective those bombings were. In any case, it was the nuclear development issue, the nuclear warhead development issue, really at the core of this, as Israel and the United States going along stated. From the Clinton administration to the present, this has been a chronic issue for 30 years, from 1995 to 2025. This is exactly what Israel and the West have been saying. This is the same Israel that dragged the Bush administration into war against Iraq, pursuing regime change. If you just change the regime in Iraq, everything will be fine in the Middle East, simply because Israel has always pursued, since its founding in 1948, a policy of Lebensraum, the Greater Israel policy, and a policy of Israeli hegemony in the Middle East. And the US, of course, was always behind Israel, allowing it to get away with all of this. That's a matter of record. And now it more and more is revealed, not just by critics, by the way, okay, but rather former Israeli officials as well as Israeli scholars who have written on this issue. The issue has never been nuclear weapons because Iran has the ability to develop them at any time. In the mid-1940s, when the Manhattan Project was ongoing, the American nuclear physicists, headed by Robert Oppenheimer, in charge of the Manhattan Project, pointed out that once the United States tested the first atomic weapon, and Oppenheimer saw its impact, scientists, nuclear physicists in the United States pointed out that the atomic bomb development must stop it, and because there will be proliferation, for a very simple reason. Nuclear warhead development is in the human brain. It's that simple. If Iran wanted to develop a bomb, it would have had it. It doesn't want it because it has other priorities, namely economic development. Iran is interested in pursuing the route of China, not the route of Russia. It's interested in pursuing economic and social development. It has had GDP growth of rather 3% averaging or so, 2.8 or something like that in the last 20 years. Its prospects, according to the IMF and the World Bank, its prospects for GDP growth this year and next year, 2025 and 2026, are not very good. They're close to zero. Iran wants economic development. It does not, it wants to trade developing the nuclear bomb, the warheads, for economic development, realizing also that it will be less secure because then Saudi Arabia, which has already said that why not them have a nuclear bomb? Why not? Not only do they want nuclear energy, which both Saudi Arabia and Iran do want, by the way, they want nuclear development, but for energy. Okay, in that regard, Saudi Arabia and Iran are on the same page. But Saudi Arabia, obviously, if Iran develops nuclear warheads, Saudi Arabia would as well. So the entire region becomes less stable. Now, there are scientists who argue that this is rather easy. There are political analysts who argue that it's dangerous, but there are also a few who argue that if Iran had nuclear weapons, if they had nuclear warheads, which Israel does, by the way, 90 nuclear warheads, Iran 0, and yet Iran is the aggressor when Israel is the one bombing, arguing in self-defense. It's bombing. How can you bomb the other side with 0 nuclear warheads and be on self-defense? Many scholars have pointed out that self-defense can be described any way the government wants it to be described, just like the term terrorism. It's so generic, anyone's enemy becomes a terrorist. The state becomes a terrorist. Groups become terrorists as the government wishes, as that entity wishes to define them. So the idea that Iran is the aggressor when it's the recipient of bombing, unprovoked bombing by Israel, in order to stop it from developing nuclear warheads when it was in negotiations to with the United States so that it doesn't develop them. And Israel all along was sabotaging those negotiations and its pro-Zionist allies in the United States, by the way, were on the side of Israel, encouraging the Trump administration, as Putin at one point, maybe he did it deliberately, maybe he did it, most likely Putin, as a former KGB officer, I'm sure did it deliberately, pointed out that Trump is not calling the shots. The people behind Trump who represent vested interests, billionaires who are driven by ideology, namely the ideology of Western supremacy, Western hegemony in the Middle East through Israel at the regional level, and containment of China and Russia. That's what drove Trump to finally drop the bombs, which were not effective, as we find out, to the embarrassment of the Trump administration, because it came out and celebrated. Only the chief of staff at the Pentagon, in a committee hearing setting, when asked, the defense secretary Hegseth said, well, yeah, it was a resounding, he basically repeated what Trump was saying. The chief of staff was more reserved. He said, well, let's just do an assessment of it. He knew when he said, let's just do an assessment of it, that the US bombing of those 3 nuclear sites did not accomplish the goal. In fact, just this morning, June 25th, 2025, Israeli analysts came out and maintained that unless the US drops 100 bombs in those 3 sites of the type that it did, it's not going to make much of a difference. And even if it did, the Iranians had said that they had moved the essential equipment and matter, that is uranium, from those sites. So all of this was a game of deception to satisfy what? Delusional assumptions and thinking, when none of it was needed, and all of it could have been accomplished through diplomacy to achieve the goal of not having Iran develop nuclear weapons, okay, and to stop the war at the same time. All along, by the way, the genocide war in Gaza, genocide war, not the way not my terms, the International Court has defined this as a genocide war. The fact is, a number of US elected officials call it genocide. Bernie Sanders, among many others, okay? Former Israeli officials maintain, if this is not a case of war crimes in Gaza, what is it? What do we call what has been happening from October 2023 to the present? All of it, Israel trying to cover it up with the support of the United States, because it was revealed again just yesterday that the US Navy has been heavily involved in intercepting Iranian missiles, and the US military has been much more involved in Israel's execution of that war in Gaza against civilian population. Again, as Senator Bernie Sanders pointed out, you're killing women, children, and unarmed civilians there. All along, there have been very costly operations of the United States, not counted as part of the US aid, which Israel is the world's number one military aid recipient, by the way, at a very high cost to the US taxpayer, using interceptor missiles to bring down anything, any incoming ballistic missiles to Israel and drones, okay? All along, this has been happening at the cost of hundreds of millions to the US taxpayer, okay? All of it could have been avoided, all of it, if negotiations through diplomacy, again, as President Trump pointed out just this morning, 25th of June, if negotiations had been pursued and a solution to what Iran wanted, namely economic development, by not by having the West lift sanctions, and actually the Iranians realized that the United States wanted, or United States companies wanted, a piece of economic development in Iran with regard, for example, to nuclear energy, and Iran was willing to go along with that to the tune of hundreds of billions, all the way up to $1 trillion. Okay, they learned a very important lesson from the Gulf states, promising hundreds of billions, up to $1 trillion and more investment in the United States. So Iran was following the same playbook as the Gulf states in that regard, just to get the economic and social development they wanted. They had their agenda. Okay. Now, the the question, of course, is that the United States under Trump had promised on January 20th, when he was inaugurated, he stated, and I quote, "My proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker and a unifier." That legacy no longer holds because he became involved in Israel's forever war doctrine. Israel has had a history of perpetual warfare against its neighbors, a history of destabilizing the region along with the United States. The United States has gone along with this. Now, during the Cold War, the United States could argue, well, Israel is in the forefront. It's a frontline state against the non-aligned back in the 60s and early 70s, the Nasser regime in Egypt, allied with Syria back then, and of course the non-aligned bloc being very important, and adamantly against Israel, of course. All right, fine. And the non-aligned was close also back then to China, less so to Russia, although there were ties with Russia. Obviously, the Soviet Union back then built the Aswan Dam in Egypt, a proud project for Nasser. The United States clearly has been on an economic decline for a long time. If you look at the GDP of the United States and China in 1990, and you look at that same thing today in PPP terms, in purchasing power parity, we have seen in those 35 years China's astronomical economic development overtaking the United States between 1990 and 2025. The GDP measured in purchasing power parity terms of China is between 7 and 11 trillion ahead of the United States, depending whose estimates, whose numbers you look at. But the IMF and the World Bank clearly point out, no matter how you count it, China is the world's largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity. China is the world's number one manufacturing country. China is the world's number one shipping country. China is the world's number one trading partner, including, by the way, a trading relationship that's very important. It's essential to both the United States and its NATO allies. The legacy of the United States in terms of Trump's own pronounces my proudest legacy, I meant to say Trump's legacy, my proudest legacy, will be that of a peacemaker, is really a continuation of militarism. It reminds me of what the great American scholar, Professor William Appleman Williams, wrote during the tail end of the Vietnam War. He wrote a brief book and a brilliant study entitled Empire as a Way of Life. This is militarism as a way of life, because William Appleman Williams was absolutely right that the United States became England Junior. It emulated throughout its history from the founding fathers to the Vietnam War, when Williams was writing all of this. It emulated the model of the mother country, an empire, a global empire. That's the legacy of the United States, except that in its twilight, economically, on a world scale, as the core of the capitalist world system is shifting, has been shifting, by the way, in the last 35 years, from the transatlantic West to East Asia and South Asia. India will soon be overtaking the United States in terms of GDP measured in purchasing power parity. India is developing very rapidly. One of the reasons that the Trump administration imposed tariffs on everybody, India included, on Japan, on Canada. Good news, by the way, the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, announced last night that the United States no longer wants to reduce Canada into the 51st state. One of the reasons that the United States imposed tariffs is because it has been desperate for a strategy to stop China, elevate itself. And what model is it looking at? It's looking at economic nationalism model, which is a model followed by the United States when it was industrializing in the late 19th century, early 20th century. It was in the period of industrialization, and during that period, at the same time, during the McKinley administration, of course, McKinley is someone that Trump admires. It also pursued a militaristic goal of acquiring territories not belonging to the United States, namely in the Spanish-American War. So we're going back to that era, which Trump calls the golden age, the gilded age, in other words, back then. That's what it was called back then. He wants to bring back the gilded age of empire and of robber barons and of U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. That's why he argued initially when he came, he insisted on retaking the Panama Canal, denying it to the Chinese, as though the Chinese own it. In any event, what we have here is a foreign policy based not on any rational grounds, any grounds based on reality, but rather delusion and aspirations of hegemony. And Israel comes along and takes advantage of this situation that the United States is in, takes advantage of it, and with its considerable influence through the Israeli lobby in Washington and very powerful Wall Street interests, and of course the military-industrial complex, those interceptor missiles that the U.S. Navy uses, by the way, are made by Raytheon, and they cost $30 million a piece. That the U.S. Navy was using on behalf of Israel to shoot down Iranian ballistic missiles, not just now, all along throughout the execution of this war between Israel and its neighbors, and of course the Gaza war from October 2023. And interestingly enough, the Department of Defense argues, well, we're running out of those, we need more. Now that's also, this is hundreds of millions for the Raytheon Corporation. Clear winner. The military-industrial complex, a clear winner. Why would they not want a policy of destabilization and forever war doctrine in the Middle East, or anywhere for that matter, but in the Middle East especially, historically volatile, considering they're making money, their stock, when you look at the stock price of Raytheon, all the companies here, the military, they're doing fine. They're doing well. Okay. Now, the question of the U.S. involvement in the war in Iran, the bombing, I should say. The U.S., by the way, according to Vice President J.D. Vance, argues that this was not a war by the United States against Iran. It was just a bombing of their nuclear facilities. Not a war against Iran. We're not in a war against Iran. On June 22nd, the U.S. did bomb. In doing so, it did not follow the playbook of the Bush administration when the Bush administration, in order to invade Iraq, it had no problem, of course, invading Afghanistan. Everyone knows, the world knows, the history has been written on the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. The world knows the end result of that. And I'll mention the estimated cost of those. At the very least, they did go to Congress. They did, yes, with false evidence that Iraq did have weapons of mass destruction. They also followed the playbook of going to the United Nations Security Council, again with false evidence, arguing Iraq had weapons of mass destruction when they knew, because their own people, their own security analysts who had gone to inspect, found no evidence that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. They wanted regime change because Israel dragged the U.S., as Jeffrey Sachs, among many others, have pointed out, into that war, so that Israel could be stronger while weakening one of the neighbors, namely Iraq. Okay. Once that was done, after 20 years, the U.S. taxpayer was left with the cost of what that execution of the war was. Okay, along with Afghanistan. According to Brown University, which keeps statistics on this, it's anywhere between $5 and $7 trillion added to the U.S. public debt. One of the reasons that the Congress right now, and the Trump administration, Republicans rather, I shouldn't say all of Congress, and the Senate are looking, the House and the Senate Republicans and the Trump administration are trying to cut social programs from Medicaid to all sorts of social programs, is because the budget has risen substantially because of U.S. military ventures like this. This is not the fault of the Trump administration or of Republicans. On the contrary, Trump was very restrained in his first term in terms of starting wars. He argued he didn't want involvement. It's too costly. U.S. gets nothing except the bill to the taxpayers. It raises the debt. He wasn't interested in it. He was interested in following neoliberal policies that give back trillions to the richest Americans, to the richest 5% of Americans, just as he is now. But he wasn't particularly interested in the neoconservative forever war doctrine at all. He didn't want U.S. military entanglements, okay? To his credit, by the way, he tried to follow that playbook in his second term, not very successfully, because as it was revealed early on after he took over, the Israeli lobby prided itself to one of the journalists who revealed the story, I believe it was Max Blumenthal, who said that we have our people, pro-Israeli elements surrounding Trump, and he will listen to them. And behind those people were Wall Street billionaires, both Jewish and non-Jewish, supporting all all of this. So what we have here, and this is a point, a very important point I want to make, is a convergence of US war aims with regard to Iran. When a country goes to war, any country, it has to have some war aims, otherwise it becomes a video game. It becomes nothing but some frivolous game, just engaged in destruction for the sake of destruction, which human beings, by the way, with the capacity for creativity, also have the capacity for utter destruction, for mass destruction. Now, what were the war aims? There was actually convergence of US and Israeli war aims here. Okay, one is to prevent Iran from securing nuclear warheads. Fine, Iran was willing to sit down and negotiate with this. Not negotiate, by the way, its relationship with its regional group allies. By group, I mean Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthi rebels, other smaller groups in the Middle East. It was not willing to do that. It was not willing also to refrain from pursuit of its, what Iran regards as its rightful role to basically continue to pursue economic and strength and national sovereignty without external interference, which is another way of saying that they would keep a strong military and not yield in order to secure their goal, which would be which would be geopolitical hegemony for themselves, again, by negotiating, and they did negotiate thanks to China with Saudi Arabia. China was responsible for rapprochement, I believe, about a year or so ago, perhaps a little bit longer, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. No compromise when it came to Israel, because Israel was a sworn enemy of the Iranian Revolution. It wanted regime change, and it wanted to weaken Iran and in its greater Israel Lebensraum, which means living space, by the way, German word, that the Zionist regime has embraced. And by the way, according to public opinion polls, 80% of the Israeli Jews, who are citizens, of course, there, support all of this. As it turns out, just as there is support in Iran for the Ayatollahs, because regardless of how weak the economy is, which is, as the IMF and the World Bank pointed out, GDP growth close to zero. Similarly, there is support for by Israelis for their government, because war forces people to rally around the flag. So that's an important issue to consider. I want to spend a little bit of time, because I see I'm almost up on the hour, on the issue of results of the of all of this. The question of national sovereignty in Iran is up to the Iranian people, whatever they want to do with it. It's not up to Israel and to the United States or any external factors. Just like Iran did not go to Israel and try to determine what kind of regime it wants there, and just like Iran did not come to the United States and say, well, by the way, we don't like this regime, let's change the regime. It feels that it does not, at least, this is not to make them out to be angels, by the way. This is a theocratic medieval regime based on religious law. It is not up with the times in terms of secular liberal democratic thinking. That's not the tradition it has. However, the issue of national sovereignty belongs with the people of Iran. This is an Enlightenment era thinking. This is Enlightenment era principle of the 18th century, and supposedly the West is supposed to respect that. Now, the results of this war lasting 12 days that Israel launched against Iran with the United States behind it are very interesting, because this war proved that this Islamic world was not behind Iran, no matter what the pronouncements were. Okay. The Persian Gulf countries continued normal trade relations. They also provided, including, by the way, Jordan, not a Persian Gulf, but Jordan provided Israel the right to use its airspace to attack Iran. Okay. As it turns out, India was expected, not a Muslim country, Hindu country with one of the largest Muslim populations in the world. India did also side with Israel and the United States, but that India made no secret. The Prime Minister Modi made no secret of that from day one, from October 2023. Okay. Pakistan is really the major issue here, because it has been revealed by the President of the United States, but also independent sources, that Pakistan, which had used liberal rhetoric, and by liberal I mean generous rhetoric toward Iran. Yes, we're behind you. We're going to even provide you with nuclear warheads if you need them. Actually, it made a deal with the United States just a few days before the U.S. struck Iran. And the deal was with, it pertains to mineral resources. Pakistan is rich in mineral resources, not a particularly wealthy country, by the way. It is struggling, just like Iran is struggling economically and in terms of social development. The government of Pakistan argued that it has all these mineral resources. Yes, it has a very close relationship with China, but it also wanted to diversify its foreign economic policy and look to the United States. It came to and offered, put on the table, not $500 billion worth of mineral deal that the Ukrainians offered the United States, the Trump administration, but $1 trillion and more long-term deal. Pakistan, in fact, was willing to put up Trump as a nominee for the Nobel Peace Prize during the war that Israel had launched against Iran, and the U.S. behind it, and knowing that the U.S. was the #1 military supplier and aid country to Israel throughout the execution of Israel's war in Gaza that the International Court has labeled genocide. It turns out that Iran was on the same page as India, although it had come very close, and that issue is still not resolved, to an all-out war against India just a few weeks before. And yet, on the side of the United States, it abandoned Iran, no matter what it said. And by the way, they disputed officially, the government said, no, don't believe the stories in the press. Anyway, Trump himself said this, that yes, they were on the same page as India. The other issue here, one of the results is, besides the lack of support by Muslim countries, and it's not just Pakistan, Jordan, okay, the Saudis, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, all of them were at the very least passive, but really more accommodating to Israel. Jordan, very accommodating. The United Arab Emirates, very accommodating. Saudi Arabia, none of them traded their interests as they perceive them, geopolitical or geoeconomic, for the sake of Iran. Turkey talked a good game. It didn't compromise any of its interests. It talked, again, the rhetoric. There's a gap between the rhetoric of Muslim countries and the reality of foreign policy substance, and that's what's at issue. It's interesting that there have been some journal articles and scholarly articles that argue, why should the Muslim countries do any of this when China, the number one economic sponsor of Iran, also stood by the sidelines? China wasn't risking anything. Russia, again, very liberal with its rhetoric, very generous with the rhetoric on the side of Iran, its strategic partner, but really leveraging Iran. Let's face it, Russia leveraged Iran. It did not leverage it, it leveraged it in the manner that Nikita Khrushchev leveraged Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis when John Kennedy was president. And Fidel Castro was outraged that the Kremlin would leverage Cuba amid such a crisis when Cuba's whole existence was at stake. But Putin, a former KGB man, was in a sense leveraging, as Trump revealed. Again, we have to go by what Trump is saying here. As Trump revealed, he was offering to be accommodating. What can I do for you, Mr. President, here with regard to Iran? I have leverage over them. So he was leveraging Iran. It's, in other words, this is an ugly world. This is a world of national interests, and each country is pursuing its national interests. The question is, was international law violated, and who violated it? According to the UN Secretary General, the countries that initiated the bombing violated international law. Iran was responding to the violation of international law by the countries initiating the bombing. Okay. Even Putin was outraged, and this was genuine outrage, that Trump actually risked so much creating global economic chaos when he ordered on the 22nd of June, 9 days later, after, not the 22nd of June, sorry, when he ordered the bombing of the 3 sites in Iran with nuclear development weapons. The outrage was that the risk was nuclear fallout and also creating a crisis because Iran immediately threatened to close the Straits of Hormuz, and the Iranian parliament did pass legislation approving closing the Straits of Hormuz temporarily, by the way. So the risk became high level, and it meant that then countries would really have to choose, because Iran was going to start bombing US bases. It did in Qatar. According to some press reports, I believe the New York Times may have been one of the sources, this whole thing was a fix so that it would give Iran an out and the US an out, save face, that Iran would bomb a US military base with short-term and intermediate ballistic missiles. They would be countered, they would be blown up in the air, there would be no damage. And then immediately after that, what we see is Trump coming out to the surprise of everyone and saying, oh, by the way, the Iranians have come to us and have asked for a ceasefire. According to Iranian officials, the US came to them and asked for a ceasefire. According to Iranian officials, Israel wanted a ceasefire while it continued bombing Iran, by the way. Okay? This is why Trump became angry and publicly used undiplomatic language against Israel. It's his own ally. Um, and so what we have here is that the pressure was really on Israel and the United States to end this conflict. They had nothing to gain. Netanyahu had something to gain. He wanted to legitimize the genocide war. And to do it, he needed to convert it into a broader conflict involving a country that many in the West do not like, Iran. They haven't liked it since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And they do want, many in the West want regime change in Iran. Okay, a lot of people may want a lot of things, but it's not happening because that's up to the people of Iran to determine the sovereignty of their government. There was an interesting report in a European journal that I read about that comes from all places. Deutsche Bank analysts. Deutsche Bank, of course, a world bank, a bank with a world presence, international presence, and involved in a lot of schemes over the years, including laundering money from all kinds of sources. But the Deutsche Bank issued a report that Europe was a major loser as a result of what Israel and the U.S. did in Iran. Europe, according to Deutsche Bank, and of course this was, of course, a jab at the United States, and also a signal to their own government, to the government in Germany and to the European Union, that the Europeans really took the brunt of economic pain from both both the Ukraine war since 2022 and the Israeli Gaza campaign against the people of Palestine, against the people of Gaza. That the Europeans suffered more economically than anyone else because the Europeans are energy dependent. The US has the largest oil deposits in the world, by the way. US didn't suffer anything from this. Plus, the Europeans are the ones who are left with the flood of Muslims coming in, and then the right-wing elements and the conservative elements in Europe complain, well, Europe is being diluted. The culture of Europe, as though Europe has a homogeneous culture, the culture of Europe is being diluted by Muslims coming in. Our Christian identity, what Christian identity? Christian identity existed in the Middle Ages in Europe, when Western Christendom was around. There's no Christian identity in Europe. Europe is very secular and very heterogeneous culturally. In any event, the Deutsche Bank report was interested because they argued that this was harmful to the European interest, the German interests specifically. Yet, the government of Germany, just like the governments of much of the rest of Europe, solidly behind the US, solidly behind Israel, all along. Okay. Now, the world crisis of that was created by roughly 2 weeks of hostilities between that Iran launched against Israel launched against Iran. That Israel launched against Iran, the United States was supporting, had some winners. The winners were the manufacturers of weapons, not just in the US, but elsewhere as well. Inadvertently, by the way, Russia and China do also come out as winners from this. It will make it much easier for Russia to negotiate now peace with Ukraine, because Ukraine will not be putting up much of a resistance, as the latest news from Volodymyr Zelensky indicates. He will not have any preconditions to going to the negotiating table with the Russians. China sat on the sidelines, right? China pursuing economic hegemony on a world scale sat on the sidelines, figuring this will work out itself out, and they will still be the number one presence, the number one trading partner of the Middle East. And they are, and they remain so. The bombing that the U.S. engaged in on behalf of Israel cost hundreds of millions. The mission of the three stealth B-2 bombers on those three nuclear sites in Iran cost 50 million minimum just on those missions without the supportive services of those three planes, by the way. So the taxpayer is left with, the US taxpayer is left with the bill and has absolutely nothing to show for it, considering that President Trump this morning noted that things look very good, very promising for a return to a diplomatic solution, because all military conflict is resolved through diplomacy. So the military solution was never viable. The last point I want to make is about the press. And unfortunately, this reflects the lack of credibility by the Western press. When you look at reports of 12 days of Israel bombing Iran and then Iran returning the favor through by bombing Haifa and Tel Aviv, among other places, what we see is there is a disconnect between how non-Western press reports and shows video and pictures of what was happening and how the Western press reports it and analyzes it. Western media used the influence that it has in the world to argue that Israel was inflicting enormous damage along with the United States, that Iran at any time was about to cave, that the Iran regime at any time was about to collapse, and that the Ayatollah Khamenei was about to be finished. In fact, the man is old, as he pointed out himself. He's in his late 80s, I believe he's 86 or 87. As he pointed out, he's an old man. He has all kinds of illnesses. He, in fact, has appointed at least three successors, I believe. That wasn't the issue here. The issue here was how the Western media mirrored whatever their governments were saying. And their governments reflected the US-Israeli position, which was not the reality, as we now find out from the Western governments themselves, as they one after another begin to come out and say, yeah, by the way, this was not such a good idea. And let's get back to diplomacy. So misinformation, disinformation were really victims of this. It is not optimistic, although Trump said he's optimistic about diplomacy. I remain pessimistic about two things, namely that Israel will change its Greater Israel policy, Lebensraum policy, and its apartheid policy for the Palestinians. I don't think that's going to change. I don't see that Israel will agree to two-state solution. In other words, something that Saudi Arabia says is a precondition to normalizing relations with Israel. Among other countries have said that. Although they continue normal trade relations with Israel, not punishing Israel for not pursuing this. I don't believe that the United States will end the destabilization policy, which has been long-standing policy, bipartisan, nor will the United States stop with its militarism as a way of life, considering it doesn't have any other leverage left, given that China is the world's number one economic power, as I already stated. Anyone can look at Goldman Sachs, IMF, World Bank, any statistics you want to look at, that the GDP of China, measured in purchasing power parity value, is several trillion above that of the United States. On top of that, the United States is about to go even greater public debt, as above 37 million, trillion dollar debt. And it is about to go over that because the United States is about to pass a $4.5 trillion package, much of that give backs to the wealthiest Americans and corporations. So I am not that optimistic that normalization is going to be long lasting. We will have to wait and see. At the very least, Iran may achieve its goal of trading nuclear development. For now, at least, it may trade that for economic development with the West. That's not for certain either, but we will see what happens. I want to thank you for listening. I want to invite you to please send in your questions, comments, join this channel. It's an educational channel. Thank you very much. Thank you.